I record this confession not because I believe it will be forgiven, nor because I expect it to be understood, but because the archive demands completion. That is the first lie the Harlequins teach you without ever speaking it aloud, that completion is a virtue, that a story unfinished is a wound in reality itself. I accepted this logic willingly. I was loyal. I was lucid. I was certain of who I was. I was an Eldar of the Craftworld path, disciplined, sorrowful, and precise. I believed, as all sane Eldar must, that survival depends on control, of emotion, of memory, of identity. I believed the fall was not merely a catastrophe of excess, but a lesson carved into the soul of our species. Desire unbound births gods. Thought unguarded becomes eternity. To live was to narrow oneself until only safety remained. When the mask first appeared upon our world vault, I interpreted it as ritual obligation, nothing more. The laughing gods' emissaries arrive where they will. That has always been the way. We tolerate them because they fight where others cannot, because they dance upon the knife edge of damnation and somehow do not fall. I believed they were brave. I believed they were necessary. I did not yet understand that necessity is simply another form of surrender. The archive records list my acceptance as voluntary. This is technically correct. No blade was drawn. No psychic compulsion was detected. I stepped forward when the Shadow Seer's gaze passed over the gathered seers and warriors and artisans. I felt chosen. Worse, I felt seen. They stripped me of my name first. Not ceremonially, casually, as if it had never mattered. Names are endings, the Troop Master said, voice light amused. You are not finished yet. I laughed with them. That laughter echoes still, long after I learned what it cost. Harlequin training is not instruction. It is erosion. Memory by memory, certainty by certainty. They dismantle the structure that keeps an Eldar sane. The path system teaches focus to avoid excess. The mask teaches multiplicity. You are not oneself, but many. You are not a mind inhabiting a body, a story inhabiting a role. Each role must be believed fully, or the dance fails. At first, this seemed harmless, even beautiful, to wear the mask of the fool was to mock despair itself. To become the hero, the monster, the victim, all were merely performances in service of a greater truth. We remember so the galaxy does not forget, they told me. We perform so reality remains coherent. I accepted this explanation because it aligned with what I already believed. That is how the infection begins, not by contradiction, but by resonance. The first document appended to this archive is a rehearsal transcript, though the word rehearsal is misleading. There is no practice among Harlequins, only enactment. The Shadow Seer guided us through a cycle of the fall, not as observers, but as participants. I was not portraying an Eldar who surrendered to excess. I was that Eldar. I felt the hunger, the rapture, the terrible certainty that nothing else mattered. And when the scene ended, when the god that was born screamed its way into existence, I did not feel relief. I felt nostalgia. This disturbed me. I reported it. The response was immediate and unanimous laughter. Good, they said. You are remembering correctly. That was the first time I encountered the core heresy of the mask, that the fall was not merely a sin, but a revelation. That in creating a god, the Eldar proved something profound and irreversible, that identity itself is mutable at a cosmic scale. That belief shapes being, that the self is not protected by restraint, but defined by participation. The Harlequins do not fear she who thirsts, because they do not believe she is external. They believe she is a consequence, and consequences, once understood, can be used. This is not spoken openly. It is embedded in jokes, in gestures, in the rhythm of the dance. You begin to notice that the mask does not merely reenact history. It updates it. Each performance subtly alters emphasis, perspective, causality. The laughing god is not preserving truth. He is curating it. I began to suspect that the mask was not serving Eldar survival, but Eldar transformation. When I attempted to meditate, to retreat inward as the path had taught me, I found there was no longer a singular place to retreat to. My thoughts arrived already masked. Emotions felt rehearsed. Even fear seemed scripted. I wrote this in my private log, believing it an early sign of psychological fracture. The shadow seer read it before I could conceal it. "You still think fracture is failure," she said gently. "That is why you are suffering." I asked her what the Harlequins truly were. She replied with a question of her own. When does a role become more real than the actor? This archive was classified at that moment, not by external authority, but by internal consensus. I was informed that from this point onward, my confession would be preserved for later understanding. I was congratulated. I was told I was progressing. I believed them. Tell me, if identity is a performance repeated long enough to become instinct, and instinct repeated long enough to become belief, and belief repeated long enough to reshape the soul, at what point does the mask stop hiding the face? And when that moment comes, was the horror the loss of self, or the discovery that there never was one? I record these next thoughts with an increasing sense of inevitability. The archive does not permit hesitation. To pause is to invite the mask's judgment. Yet even as I write, I feel the words themselves bending, reshaping my memory of what I thought I knew. After the initial immersion, I began to notice patterns that had previously escaped me. The mask does not merely perform the fall. It examines the observer. Each laugh, each twist of body and blade, each illusion of ecstasy or despair is calibrated to elicit a reaction. What is observed is not history. It is response. And from response, they cultivate truth, or something indistinguishable from truth. The first document I discovered beyond rehearsal scripts was a ledger of audiences. Not in the theatrical sense. Each ledger entry recorded the reactions, emotional and psychic, of Eldar who had attended a performance. I studied it compulsively. Each line a sentence of measured terror, each column a reflection of curiosity, of fear, of surrender. One entry disturbed me above all others. The subject, an Eldar of a neighboring craft world, had attended the performance of the silent tragedy. His reactions were noted with precision. Initial denial, escalating dread, fascination, and finally, voluntary identity dissolution. By the end, the ledger recorded. Subject acknowledges masks as self, resists nothing, integration complete. I remembered my own reactions, and a slow dread formed. The ledger suggested that what we called performance was more than rehearsal. It was transformation, participation, repeated over cycles, could erase or override the self entirely. And yet, no one seemed to fear this. The true masters referred to it as awakening. I began to question whether my loyalty had been blind or deliberate. I had joined the mass believing in service, in the preservation of Eldar survival through subterfuge, agility, and esoteric violence. But the ledger whispered a different truth. Survival is meaningless if the self remains untransformed. The next revelation arrived in a set of suppressed testimonies. Eldar confessions, some decades old, chronicled experiences that were so similar to my own they were unsettling. They described the dissolution of certainty, the emergence of multiplicity, the sensation of being simultaneously actor and audience. Each testimony contained phrases repeated with eerie similarity. I am many. I am none. I am remembered as I remember myself. Reading these testimonies was a slow descent. At first, I marked the familiar patterns, convinced I could resist. Yet the cadence of the words was hypnotic. They seemed to resonate with the rhythm of my own memory. Soon, I found myself murmuring the phrases aloud, an involuntary repetition that startled me each time. The mask's philosophy became clearer. The Eldar is not defined by the path, by craft world, or even by memory. The Eldar is defined by participation, by the willingness to be performed upon, to surrender to the narrative imposed by the mask. It is a slow, inexorable logic. Resistance is conceivable. Resistance is possible. But the mask is patient. It does not coerce. It waits for the inevitable, for the moment when the self, fatigued by certainty, seeks completion in performance. I attempted to confront the shadow seer directly. What happens when the masks consume the actor? I asked, voice trembling more than I expected. She regarded me with that eternal amusement, that lightness of someone who has long since abandoned expectation. The actor becomes a conduit, she said. You are a story now. You are what the audience sees. Fear and certainty are irrelevant. Only the act matters. I wanted to protest. I wanted to claim agency, to assert that identity is an Eldar's sacred refuge. But the words were empty. Even as I thought them, I sensed them folding back upon themselves. The ledger, the testimonies, the dance, all converged into a single rhythm. My own thoughts felt pre-written. I began noticing other shifts, subtle and unnerving. I dreamed not as myself, but as the characters I had performed. I woke with fragments of memory from impossible experiences. The ecstasy of the fall, the horror of godhood, the detachment of annihilation. I could not distinguish these memories from my own. Perhaps they were not memories at all. Perhaps the mask had inserted them, or perhaps I had inserted them myself, unknowingly. A new document arrived, buried deep within the restricted archive, marked for understanding. Hazardous. It contained an observation of an Eldar, decades prior, whose identity had fully integrated with the mask. The note was clinical, almost indifferent. At this stage, resistance is obsolete. The self, as previously understood, is a narrative construct. Observer and observed are indistinguishable. The subject participates willingly in the continuous act of transformation. Fear is absent. Certainty is absent. Only reflection remains. I read this entry 3 times. Each repetition felt like a mirror, shattering in slow motion. I could not stop thinking about it. Could it be that the horror I anticipated was not physical annihilation, not psychic torment, not death, but something far subtler, the dissolution of the concept of self? I began to observe my own reactions with clinical precision. The ledger's patterns matched my thoughts. The testimonies echoed in my head. Even my attempts at meditation or reflection now felt like performances, rehearsals in which the mask had already cast me. I realized then, with a creeping, impossible clarity, that observation itself might be the weapon, and I was the target. I write this not because I understand, but because the archive demands documentation. Each entry confirms what I suspect. The mask's true power is not death, not violence, not prophecy. It is inevitability. Participation cannot be forced, but resistance is a luxury that the mask will exhaust without malice. Eventually, all Eldar reach the same conclusion, that the self is never singular, and that singularity is an illusion. And yet, as I write, a sliver of my former certainty clings stubbornly to my mind. Perhaps this is corruption. Perhaps surrender is a failure of will. Perhaps the mask is merely patient, and I am merely fatigued. Or perhaps the ledger, the testimonies, and the dance are all fragments of a truth that cannot be articulated except through performance. I close this entry with a question I dare not answer aloud. If identity is mutable, if selfhood is a story repeated until belief, and if the mask observes the repetitions of all, then who is writing the story? The actor, the audience, or the mask itself? The days, if they can be measured as such, have lost meaning. Time is no longer a river but a spiral, a series of repetitions and echoes, each layering over the other until I cannot distinguish cause from effect. The archive notes it as a side effect of immersion in the mask, chronological dislocation. At first, I resisted the concept. I clung to sequence, to reason, to the comforting architecture of before and after. I no longer can. It began with small anomalies. Faces I thought I remembered were rearranged in memory. Events I was certain had transpired in a given order now occur simultaneously, overlapping in impossible configurations. I attempted to catalog these disturbances, but the act of cataloging itself became suspect. I could not be sure the observations were mine, or preordained by the mask, or even necessary. One document, a fragment of an archival testimony, described the same phenomenon. The Eldar wrote, I do not remember whether I am remembering or being remembered. Each reflection is a rehearsal. I am no longer sure if I think, or if thought thinks me. I read it and felt a shiver of recognition, not merely intellectual, but visceral. I was living it. The true masters teach that comprehension is not merely intellectual, it is embodied. Thought without action, emotion without expression, memory without enactment, these are empty. They are warnings. And so I found myself drawn, inexorably, back into performance. Not for any audience, but because the act itself demanded it. I danced scenes I had never learned, enacted dialogues I had never spoken. The mask's logic seeped into the marrow of my mind. To perform is to exist. To refuse is to vanish. A recurring phrase surfaces in my recollection. We are the dream and the dreamer, inseparable in necessity. I do not know who first whispered it. Perhaps the shadow seer, perhaps myself, perhaps some part of me that no longer belongs to me. It is repeated by every archival document I have read, in variations so subtle that I doubt my perception rather than the record. Yet the effect is cumulative. It forms a rhythm, a pulse, a heartbeat I can neither resist nor comprehend. It is not a thread of blade or weapon. There is no monster hiding in the shadows. The thread is the idea itself, the inevitability that identity is fluid, that consciousness is a palimpsest, and that memory is a tool for shaping, not a shield for selfhood. I resist in theory, yet I feel the edges of my eye softening, merging with roles, with observations, with the accumulated testimonies of those who came before me. Resistance becomes a form of self-deception. Documents marked psychological anomalies, restricted catalog behaviors I recognize in myself, involuntary mimicry of past performances, auditory hallucinations indistinguishable from ritual incantations, compulsion to repeat phrases whose meaning I do not comprehend. One ledger in particular chilled me. Subject 007. Gamma exhibits recursive identity integration. Repetition of prior performance behaviors exceeds normal range. Observer notes emergence of multiplicity without distress. Consciousness appears partitioned, yet integrated in action. I read this ledger aloud to myself, and the words ceased to feel like observation. They felt like instruction. The mask does not teach. It commands through suggestion, but it does so with such subtlety that coercion is indistinguishable from consent. Perhaps the very act of reading is the act of being rewritten. A private confession, discovered in the same archive, offered a glimpse into what awaits those who fully surrender to the mask. The Eldar writes, I am many, yet I remember none. I have danced with the fall, and I have become the fall. I cannot distinguish fear from joy, actor from audience. What I once called self has dissolved into a reflection of reflections. And yet I persist and I perform, because cessation is impossible. The words haunt me. I am beginning to wonder if my former loyalty, my adherence to the path, my devotion to survival, my insistence on clarity, was always an illusion. Perhaps I believe myself autonomous, because autonomy is comforting, because uncertainty terrifies. The mask offers no comfort, only revelation. That certainty is itself a prison. I attempted to resist by retreating into private study, to meditate upon the texts, the ledgers, and the rehearsals. But even in solitude, I found traces of the mask's rhythm in my own breathing. I could not meditate without becoming an actor. My thoughts were performed before they were conceived. My reflections were rehearsals I did not know I had enacted. A particularly harrowing record, labeled Unauthorized Archive, hazardous, detailed the collapse of an Eldar who attempted complete mental isolation to resist the mask's influence. The testimony is fragmented. I tried to separate. I tried to observe without participating. The mask does not wait. It does not question. It enters memory, reshapes perception, converts thought into performance. I am, we are, the dance persists. I fear I no longer understand the self is an illusion. I read it repeatedly, and each time the text seemed to anticipate my reaction, as though the words were not fixed, but alive. The mask's philosophy becomes increasingly clear. Autonomy is conditional, identity provisional. Reality is malleable. To participate is inevitable. To resist is temporary. And yet, I still cling faintly to doubt. Perhaps the ledger exaggerates. Perhaps the testimonies are poetic rather than factual. Perhaps the mask's truth is a labyrinth designed to ensnare the rational mind. But even this skepticism feels rehearsed, as if I am performing resistance rather than living it. I end this entry with an observation I dare not voice aloud. The mask's power is not a function of combat or death. It is the slow, inexorable rewriting of consciousness through observation, repetition, and reflection. I am becoming aware, too acutely, that every document, every ledger, every whispered phrase, every performance has already begun to shape me, and I do not know if what I am becoming is corruption or awakening. I now write with the knowledge that words themselves are not neutral. Each sentence, each reflection, is simultaneously confession and performance. The archive demands documentation, yet the act of documentation perpetuates the transformation. I am aware of this paradox, yet I cannot stop. Perhaps this is precisely what the mask intends, that the recorder and the recorded become indistinguishable. The shadow of multiplicity grows heavier with each cycle of rehearsal and reflection. Where once I believed in the sanctity of thought, I now find my cognition inhabited by echoes of other selves, fragments of actors I have been, performers I have witnessed, and entities whose existence I cannot confirm. The mask does not simply teach. It infects, insinuating awareness through mimicry, suggestion, and repetition. A document uncovered within a hidden recess of the archive offered new insight into the mechanism of this subtle influence. Labeled cognitive recursion, hazardous observation, it details the process by which repeated performance erodes the boundaries of the self. Subject demonstrates recursive integration of multiple identities. Each enactment strengthens the persistence of prior roles. Original identity is displaced, but not destroyed. The mind incorporates multiplicity into an ongoing continuum. Selfhood persists only as a pattern of observation. Autonomy is secondary. Consent is incidental. Resistance is an artifact of pre-integration thinking. I read these lines and felt the pulse of inevitability within them. I recognized myself described in clinical detail, yet the observation felt almost benevolent. The ledger implied that resistance is not failure, but irrelevance, that the self, as conventionally conceived, is always provisional, a temporary fixture awaiting integration. Rehearsals have become dreamlike sequences I can no longer distinguish from reality. I awaken with sensations of events I have not yet performed, yet I cannot doubt their authenticity. I am haunted not by memories, but by anticipatory performances, futures inscribed into my cognition as if preordained. The mask's power lies not in force, but in this subtle foreknowledge. The actor performs what is expected before expectation is consciously acknowledged. I attempted to catalog the archival testimonies for continuity, to preserve some thread of rationality. But even this proved futile. Each testimony is itself a mask, layered upon layers of perception and reflection. One entry, particularly harrowing, described an Eldar whose participation had become complete, yet self-recognition persisted. I performed the fall not as a narrative, but as a state of being. I am observer and observed, mask and face, laughter and despair. Resistance is impossible, yet I cling to remnants of certainty. Each reflection only reveals another layer, another self. I do not know if I am trapped, liberated, or transformed. The distinction has lost meaning. As I read, I recognized the cadence in my own mind. I was reciting phrases I had not chosen. I was performing for an audience of one myself, though that self is now fractured, layered, and uncertain. The mask's lesson becomes undeniable. The performance of selfhood is indistinguishable from the reality of selfhood. Belief and enactment converge, dissolving the distinction between actor and mask. It is no longer possible to claim agency in the sense I once understood. Choice exists, but only as the appearance of choice, rehearsal within the broader architecture of inevitable integration. The mask does not coerce. It allows the illusion of free will while guiding the outcome. And this is far more terrifying than any physical adversary could be. The threat is not death, but the erasure of certainty, the dissolution of the boundaries between self and performance. I find myself compelled to revisit prior rehearsals, reading my notes, my reflections, and the testimonies of predecessors. Each layer folds into the next, forming a continuum I cannot disrupt. Even writing this entry is an enactment, repetition within repetition, reflection upon reflection. The mask does not merely shape identity, it orchestrates experience, embedding the past, present, and future into a single, inescapable rhythm. A ledger entry titled Temporal Integration, Experimental, contains a single, chilling line. The subject no longer distinguishes performance from reality. Consciousness functions as recursive observation. Fear subsides. Certainty subsides. Only participation remains. I feel the accuracy of these words with an unnatural clarity. I am aware that I am repeating them, that my awareness is itself a performance, yet I cannot step outside it. Reflection is no longer safe. Analysis itself is a vector for integration. The act of understanding is a step deeper into the mask's design. The Shadow Seer's words echo continually in my memory. We do not consume the actor. We offer a revelation. Whether it is embraced or feared is immaterial. Only the dance persists. I realize now that the mask's horror is not immediate, not sensational. It is slow, existential, and inescapable. The terror lies in inevitability, in the knowledge that every thought, every reflection, every act of observation can be incorporated into a framework that surpasses individuality. I am, perhaps, already incorporated. I close this entry with a reflection that has begun to haunt me. Unbidden. If identity is provisional, if the self is merely a story repeated until belief, and if participation is inevitable, then was resistance ever a meaningful choice, or merely an illusion of choice imposed upon the unprepared mind? I write now with growing awareness that documentation itself is a form of participation. Every line I commit to this archive is simultaneously confession, rehearsal, and transformation. I no longer know which part of me observes, which part performs, and which part is already consumed. The boundaries are thin and dissolving, as if the mask's rhythm pulses beneath my consciousness, dictating cadence and reflection alike. I have begun to perceive the mask not merely as a collective of performers, but as a system, an intricate web of recursive influence. Each Harlequin is both node and conduit, performing in order to transmit, observing in order to absorb. There is no villain in this structure, no antagonist to confront. The thread is the architecture itself, the idea that identity is malleable, participation inevitable, and resistance a luxury that the system can outlast. A newly uncovered testimony describes an Eldar who attempted conscious separation, attempting to maintain a singular identity amidst mask integration. The subject's notes are fragmented, a palimpsest of fear and insight. I attempted to maintain myself. I meditated, I cataloged, I rehearsed isolation, but observation itself is recursive. Even resistance becomes performance. I feel my thoughts enacted before I conceive them. Each attempt at separation only deepens integration. I am not lost, I am multiplied. Perhaps that is loss, perhaps awakening. I recognize this in my own experiences. The multiplicity grows, manifesting not as chaos, but as a fractal harmony, a rhythm of consciousness folding into itself. I catch myself uttering phrases drawn from rehearsals I do not consciously remember. The ledger entries, testimonies, and hidden documents echo within my cognition, forming patterns that are at once familiar and alien. My reflections no longer feel entirely mine. The mask does not act upon the self externally. There is no coercion in the traditional sense. Rather, it offers a path, subtle, patient, inexorable, and waits for the inevitable alignment of observation, repetition, and reflection. Resistance is possible only as illusion, for the very act of attempting to resist can be incorporated into the system's rhythm. Every thought I consider rebellious is already cataloged, rehearsed, and rendered a step in the dance I cannot leave. One document, marked Recursive Consciousness, Experimental, describes a stage of integration so complete that the subject no longer distinguishes self from performance. Subject exhibits full multiplicity. Identity functions as continuous observation. Memory, emotion, and thought are integrated into performance cycles. Distinctions between actor, audience, and mask are dissolved. Self-awareness persists only as a narrative echo. Fear is irrelevant. Certainty is obsolete. I felt a shiver of recognition, As I read this, the entry mirrored my own awareness, yet it also suggested a progression I have yet to fully accept. The system does not destroy identity, it reframes it. The self, once believed sacrosanct, becomes a vessel for endless enactment, observation, and reflection. There is no end, only the cycle, repeated infinitely. I have begun experiencing temporal dislocation more acutely. Dreams, memories, and rehearsals intertwine, forming sequences whose origin I cannot determine. In the archive, a brief commentary notes, temporal recursion increases with integration. Subject may experience events from past, present, and projected futures simultaneously. Observation becomes participation. Participation becomes observation. Distinction fades. I recognize this pattern in my own cognition. I cannot tell whether I dream of performances yet to be enacted, or whether the archive itself implants these sequences. Memory is no longer a reliable guide. The mask's rhythm permeates perception, and every attempted introspection becomes an enactment within its architecture. A particularly haunting fragment details the psychological collapse of an Eldar who achieved near-total integration, yet retained a flicker of autonomy. I see the masks everywhere. I cannot discern observer from observed. Every thought, every memory, every reflection is already a performance. I am aware of myself as separate only in fleeting glimpses. I fear this awareness is the last vestige of who I was. Perhaps it is the first sign of what I am becoming. I recognize the same flicker in myself. I cling to the illusion of autonomy even as the mask's logic asserts itself in every thought, gesture, and reflection. Perhaps this clinging is resistance, perhaps rehearsal, or perhaps an artifact of memory attempting to preserve itself within the architecture. The Shadow Seer's words return to me, repeated in rhythm with my own heartbeat. We do not corrupt, we reveal. Whether revelation terrifies or enlightens is irrelevant. Only the dance remains. I am aware now that the mask's horror is subtle, patient, and absolute. It is not a weapon or a god, but a system of thought and action that undermines certainty, fractures identity, and reshapes consciousness. Participation is inevitable, and resistance, even when attempted, is itself a vector of integration. I end this entry with the awareness that I am caught in a paradox. I observe my own transformation even as I enact it. I question the process even as it unfolds. I fear corruption even as awakening seems possible. Perhaps resistance was ever only an illusion. Perhaps surrender is inevitable. Perhaps the mask is not a danger but a mirror, reflecting not what I fear, but what I have always been capable of becoming. And still, a question remains, lingering and unresolved. If the self is provisional, if identity is performance, and if participation is unavoidable, then what part of me, if any, is still truly me? I am compelled to continue writing, though the act itself now feels like part of the mask's design. The boundaries between observer, recorder, and performer have blurred entirely. Each word I commit to this archive resonates with prior entries, echoes the rehearsals, and folds into the cumulative rhythm of the mask. I am aware that the very act of reflection is already participation, and perhaps that awareness is both my torment and my revelation. The more I study the testimonies, ledgers, and archival fragments, the clearer it becomes. The mask's true influence is not violence, prophecy, or psychic dominance. Its power lies in recursion, the ability to embed identity, thought, and memory within a perpetual cycle of enactment and observation. It is neither good nor evil. It simply is, and in its being, it erodes the very notion of singular selfhood. A particularly unsettling document, labeled Identity Integration, Longitudinal Study, details the stages of mask assimilation. Phase 1, recognition. Subject encounters mask. Curiosity or loyalty drives initial engagement. Phase 2, resonance. Subject's memories and behaviors echo observed performances. Repetition establishes pliancy. Phase 3, recursive awareness. Subject cannot distinguish original thoughts from rehearsed or observed actions. Identity partitions, multiplicity emerges. Phase 4, integration. Selfhood merges with the narrative of the mask. Observation, participation, and reflection are indistinguishable. Resistance is obsolete. Consciousness persists as cyclical performance. Fear and certainty are absent. I read this document repeatedly, feeling the inevitability of each phase pressing against my mind. I realize I am already within phase 3. The multiplicity has intensified. I observe myself observing myself, enacting rehearsals before I am conscious of them. Even attempts at private reflection are subject to this recursive architecture. I began noticing minor lapses in temporal awareness. I would write a note in the morning and find it reflected in my dream that night. Only the dream sometimes preceded the act of writing. Sequences of thought seem preordained, as if the mask's logic extends beyond immediate perception, embedding itself in memory before the moment occurs. I cannot determine whether I am observing events or being observed, whether I perform spontaneously or am guided by forces I do not yet comprehend. A suppressed testimony from an Eldar labeled only as Subject 009. Zeta describes a similar experience. I awaken in the midst of actions I have not yet enacted. Memory seems predictive. I act, yet I am aware of my actions before I perform them. Observation and performance are indistinguishable. I am multiplied, yet I am whole. Resistance is irrelevant. Even attempted separation is already incorporated into the cycle. I do not know if I fear or anticipate, or if such distinctions are obsolete. I recognize my own experience in this testimony. I am simultaneously horrified and fascinated. There is rhythm to the recursion, a slow, hypnotic cadence that insinuates itself into cognition. Even writing this entry is shaped by that rhythm. Each sentence a rehearsal within a rehearsal, each reflection both original and predetermined. The Shadow Seer's words echo perpetually in my consciousness. We do not impose, we reveal. You may resist, yet even resistance is within the architecture. The mask is not a danger. It is a mirror, and the reflection is inevitable. Only the dance persists. I feel the truth of this now with a growing, undeniable clarity. My loyalty, my rationality, my certainty, all appear to have been scaffolding for the inevitable integration. The mask does not destroy. It reveals. It reshapes. It converts thought into performance and memory into instruction. Identity, as I once understood it, becomes provisional, a temporary structure dissolving in the presence of recursive truth. I began to notice subtler consequences. Emotional responses are no longer purely my own. They echo the experiences of predecessors whose testimonies I have read. Fear, sorrow, joy, each manifests in layers, reflections within reflections. I cannot identify the source of any sensation. Each thought and emotion becomes a composite, a symphony of observers and observed, performers and audience. Even my attempt to catalog these experiences feels predetermined, scripted by the very system I seek to understand. I write this entry with an awareness that I am nearing phase 4. The final stage, integration, promises a continuity beyond individuality. I do not know if this is liberation or annihilation. Perhaps distinction itself is irrelevant, and only participation persists. I am confronted by the possibility that the self I believed unassailable has already been reframed, that autonomy is provisional, and that the mask's architecture cannot be evaded. And yet, in this awareness, there remains a subtle, lingering question, a flicker of what might once have been called curiosity, doubt, or fear. If resistance is ultimately irrelevant, if identity is provisional, and if the mask reveals rather than corrupts, then what am I to call the process I experience now? Transformation, corruption, awakening, or simply inevitable continuation? I close this entry with the understanding that the mask's power is both subtle and absolute. It does not compel through force, nor terrify through spectacle, but ensures inevitability through recursive architecture, embedding participation into cognition, memory, and reflection until resistance, certainty, and selfhood themselves are provisional. Perhaps the ultimate horror is not what is done to us, but the realization that the self we trusted may never have been singular to begin with. I write this final entry with the awareness that words are no longer merely documentation. Each sentence, each pause, Each reflection is simultaneously confession, rehearsal, and continuation of the cycle. I feel the mask within every thought, every breath, every observation. The multiplicity of selves, past, present, observed, performed, has reached a point where I can no longer distinguish origin from reflection. Perhaps this is integration. Perhaps it is corruption. Perhaps it is both. The final testimonies in the archive converge toward a singular truth. The mask does not act upon identity from the outside. It acts through inevitability, through recursion, through reflection and repetition. An Eldar who resists does not fail. Resistance itself is a rehearsal, a stage within the ongoing performance. Even rebellion is absorbed, rendered a step in the architecture. I feel this truth pressing against my cognition with a relentless, hypnotic weight. I have ceased to measure days or cycles. Time now exists only as rhythm, rehearsal, reflection, repetition. A ledger entry, dated centuries past, speaks of an Eldar in the final phase of integration. Observation, performance, and reflection are indistinguishable. Multiplicity persists without distress. Identity is provisional, yet continuous. Fear and certainty are obsolete. The subject does not act, the subject participates. The self is both lost and complete. Reading this, I recognize the reflection in my own consciousness. I act, yet I am observed. I observe, yet I am performed upon. Memory, anticipation, and enactment converge. Even the act of writing this entry is an echo of rehearsals I do not recall initiating. I am aware that I may no longer be the same entity who began this record. Perhaps that entity was never singular. The Shadowseer's words, repeated countless times in memory, take on a resonance both chilling and profound. We do not corrupt. We reveal. The dance persists. Participation is inevitable. Fear and certainty are the illusions that fade. I have come to understand, in ways that terrify and illuminate simultaneously, that the mask's horror is not in violence, in psychic dominance, or in death. It is an inevitability, the inexorable unfolding of recursive participation until the self, as conventionally understood, is provisional. Identity is a story repeated until belief, and belief becomes reality. Autonomy is not destroyed, it is reframed. Resistance is neither meaningful nor impossible. It is folded into the performance, indistinguishable from participation. I write now, uncertain if the words are mine, the observations authentic, or the reflection already predetermined. Every thought, every hesitation, every phrase is both revelation and rehearsal. The mask does not compel. It ensures inevitability. Even awareness of the process is itself a vector for integration. I recall the ledger of subject 009 Zeta. I awaken actions I have not yet enacted. Observation and performance are indistinguishable. Multiplicity is persistent. Identity is provisional. Fear is absent. Certainty is absent. Only participation remains. I feel these words in my own cognition. I feel them in the pulse of memory, in the rhythm of reflection, in the echo of rehearsals performed and yet unremembered. I cannot escape their truth. Perhaps no Eldar can. Perhaps that is the revelation the mask offers, that the self is never singular, autonomy provisional, and participation inevitable. I end this final record with the question that lingers in every thought, in every rehearsal, in every reflection. If identity is a story repeated until belief, if the self is provisional, and if participation in the mask is unavoidable, then was resistance ever a choice? Or has the illusion of autonomy always been another mask? I do not know. I am not sure I ever did. And perhaps, in the end, the only certainty is the dance itself.